Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be looking at Game 15 from the 1972 World Chess Championship between Bobby Fischer and Buddy Spassky. And Bobby Fischer, coming into round 15, has a 3-point advantage, so things are looking up for him. He does have the black pieces in Game 15, but Spassky looking to get something going with the white pieces. So we'll go ahead and get started. Starts out with pawn to e4 and then pawn to c5. The Sicilian defense from Bobby Fischer. Knight to f3, pawn to d6, a pawn d4. Pawn captures, knight to d4, knight here to f6, knight c3, and then pawn to a6. So this is getting into the Najdorf defense, very common, especially from Bobby Fischer. Bishop to g5, so continuing in the main line, pawn to e6, pawn to f4, and then bishop to e7. Now, we did see Bobby Fischer in game 11 play queen down here to b6, going for the poison pawn variation. This is Bobby Fischer's favorite variation in the Najdorf defense that he had never lost ever in a competitive match before game number 11. When he played this, he ended up taking the pawn on b2, but Spassky was able to trap the queen, take the queen, and end up winning that game. So I'm not sure if Bobby Fischer was just a little gun shy after losing that just a few games ago, but at the end of the day decided to go against his favorite line in the Najdorf defense and instead just play the main line of bishop here to e7. Play continues with queen to f3, the main line, and then queen to c7. And nowadays, queen to c7 sometimes is pawn to h6, but the main line in this day and age was for the queen to come here to c7. Now we see Buddy Spassky castle on the queen side of the board, knight here to d7, bishop to d3, and there's really two lines that you'll see. Bishop to d3 is one of them. Another would be pawn to g4. Anytime you castle on one side of the board, you're usually going to be pushing your pawns to the other side, because that's generally where you're going to be seeing your opponent castle, especially since Bobby Fischer does not have a lot of protection on the queen side. Castling on the king side does look like it's going to be the most common line for Bobby Fischer, and these would be two of the most theoretical openings that you'll see from White's perspective. And the Najdorf defense is bishop here to d3 and pawn to g4. Just been studied for so long. Many chess experts have a lot of opinions on how you can continue. It's just been played in so many games. But we see Buddy Spassky play bishop to d3, pawn to b5, so really pushing onto the queen side of the board. Rook to e1, centralizing, and then bishop to b7. Bobby Fischer does have to be careful about pushing up too far. Pawn to b4 gets into trouble because of a knight here to d5. Now, if you look at it and say, well, couldn't just the pawn take here? Well, yes, he could, but after now the knight comes to f5, things get pretty tricky as far as how black is going to continue from here. The knight is attacking both the pawn here on a g7 as well as the bishop here on e7. After the knight takes, the king would have to recapture, but if black were to play something like rook to g8, then things get even more difficult. Pawn takes on d5. Now the rook is pinning down the bishop here on e7 to the king. The knight can take. It is also being protected by the rooks. All it's just really bad from black's perspective if he decides to try to push further with pawn to b4, simply because the knight can just come up here to d5. Doesn't look like that's a actual good move, but it ends up being very strong for white. So instead, Bobby Fischer correctly plays bishop here to b7. This does pin down this pawn here on e4 to the queen, so the pawn just can't push forward here to e5, which is what white would like to do. So instead, we see the bishop come here to b7, and then the queen coming over here to g3. This does get the queen out of the pin. It also opens up the door for an attack on g7 once there is an exchange here on f6. Now, without already knowing what would happen in this game, you look at this position, you would expect a lot of high-level players to play something like knight to h5. This protects the square here on g7, which could fall after there's an exchange and the queen is attacking it, as well as it just attacks this queen right here. So really puts white to the test. But that's not how Bobby Fischer plays. He's not always looking for the material advantage in a game or even material equilibrium. He's looking for the best attack that he can find. And so he says, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and castle on the queen side. Doesn't necessarily look at the fact and say, yeah, I have great protection. That's not what he's looking for. And so that's what he does. He castles on the queen side. Bishop takes on f6. The knight recaptures here on f6, and then the queen takes on g7. So Bobby Fischer not only castles to a side where he doesn't have a lot of protection, but he gives up a pawn so that he can start an attack. He plays rook here to f8, wants to protect this pawn right here, and he's going to start to attack on the queen side where he does have his own king. So queen comes back here to g3, pawn to b4. He now finds it safe to start pushing with his pawns. So pawn to b4, knight here to a4, and then rook to g8, forcing the queen to move. Queen comes back here to f2, knight to d7, trying to just move it over to the queen side of the board. King to b1, king here to b8 as well. Just wants to make sure, from black's perspective, that it's not pinned down to the queen. And then this king as well wants to make sure that it's just a safer square. Now I can start to push this pawn as well. Being on the same file as this queen is just dangerous. Pawn to c3, and this is where things get interesting from white. He has a few options as far as how Spassky wants to continue. Pawn to c4, I think, is a nice move. If the pawn wants to take here with en passant, that's fine. The knight can come back here and take. So that's going to be fine. Yes, that is a legal move for anyone that's watching it, curious how that happens. En passant is the move. Another option would be queen to e2, centralizing. This does allow for the bishop to come up here and attack. So just another threat, for the queen to get involved. So all these are good options. Now, these are definitely going to be better than something like pawn to e5 if you want to attack in the center of the board, because the bishop and the rook are both eyeing down the square here on g2. So rook comes down here to g2, forcing the queen to move. This is not going to be good for white, but instead decides to play pawn to c3, which I think gives Bobby Fischer some more attacking options. The knight plays to c5, and then the bishop comes back here to c2. We do see the exchange after knight takes on c3, a bishop here to f6. Now, we do see Spassky with a very solid setup here, especially after pawn to g3 solidified his pawn chain. He is up in material, so all things considered, white has a very good board presence. Bobby Fischer doesn't have a lot of king protection in front of that. He does have a bishop pair. That's the main thing that's going well for Bobby Fischer. At the end of the day, though, he has a lot of material, and Bobby Fischer, being a very aggressive player, knows what to do with a ton of material. So it's going to be an exciting end of the game. Bobby Fischer continues with pawn to h5. Now we see pawn to e5, trying to break up the center of the board. Now the pawn takes here on e5, pawn recaptures, and now white does have an isolated pawn in the center of the board that Bobby Fischer can start to attack. Bishop comes back here to h8, still putting pressure on here, but wants to make sure it does retreat. Now knight comes back here to f3. This does defend the square here on e5, also opens up the door for this rook on d1 to control this long open file. Rook here to d8 says, yeah, I'll go ahead and exchange that. Don't want you to have control of the d file. Bobby Fischer retakes here on d8, and now the knight comes up here to g5. So an interesting approach of how white wants to continue. Doesn't have to come up here. This does open up the door for the bishop to come down and take here on e5, which is what Bobby Fischer does. Now the queen comes up and takes on f7. So getting some of that material back, but definitely a huge turn of events as far as how white wanted to continue. He gave up that center pawn in exchange for the queen coming up here to f7, and said, yeah, if you want to exchange, that's completely fine. Still up a pawn in material. Bobby Fischer not looking to do that, recognizing that when you are down a pawn in material, you don't want to exchange down. You want to have your most important pieces still on the board so you can have a strong attack. That's exactly what he continues to do, especially with the bishop pair. He needs to be aggressive. The queen comes back here to h5, and this is probably where white gets a little greedy. The queen coming here to h5 does limit the queen involved in the action. playing something like queen to f1 still keeps it involved into the game. From here we could see the bishop take here on c3, pawn take here on c3. Maybe the rook comes down here to d5. Just imagine that the queen there on f1, and you'll see the difference in what actually happened. The queen came to h5 in the game. Bobby Fischer took on c3. After the pawn recaptured on c3, then queen to b6 check. Now, there's a couple options that British Spassky has here. They're really king here to a1 or king here to c1. King to a1 is probably the better move. We're now going to see queen to a5 attacking the pawn here on c3. And there's not a lot of great ways for white to defend this. Really, the only good way is the queen up here to h8. This is check and now defending the square. So king to a7 and then rook over here to b1. This does stop a lot of the threats, but does protect the king here on a1. So this is probably how it would continue if white chose the king here to a1. Did not, instead decide to play king here to c1, which just gets it in the center of the board, just keeps it more exposed than I think Brody Spassky wanted to. Now the queen comes to a5 check, queen up to h8, so that's going to be the same here. King to a7, pawn up here to a4, and then we see the knight come down here to d3. And I think Brody Spassky, was a little lucky here. We see Bobby Fischer had the option of the knight taking on a4, and then the bishop takes, queen takes here on a4. Maybe the queen comes down here to e5, but black can put a lot of pressure on his opponent, especially with the queen here on a8. Then he can get his rook involved at any time. He can surprise his opponent with this light square bishop. So I think this is a better option for Bobby Fischer, but in the game decided to play knight here to d3. Bishop takes, rook comes down here and takes here on d3, and then king up here to c2. Attacking the rook, rook comes back here to d5, attacking the knight, and then we see rook here to e4. Now, if you look at this and say, okay, well, the rook and the queen are both attacking the knight, why does the rook come up here to e4? Why not just take this pawn right here? Well, the knight takes on e6, and this is going to be a mating opportunity for Bobby Fischer. Queen takes on a4 check. Can't come over to the d file since the rook is defending that. So let's just say queen or king comes to b1. Queen down to b3, just moving it around. Queen to a3. King down to b1, and now rook to d1 after the king comes up here, because if the rook captures, then bishop down here to e4. The rook is forced to come up here to a d3, and then it's going to be checkmate. So instead, maybe the king comes to c2, trying to prolong things. King up here, or queen up here to a4 check, also protecting the rook here. King to b2, and then rook to d2. King down here to b1. And then it is going to be a checkmate very, very quickly. So things would be bad if that knight decided to come up and take there on e6. Now, if we come back and say, okay, well, instead the rook came here to e4, now the rook comes back to d8. Why does Bobby Fischer not take the knight here on g5? He absolutely could. That is one of the options that he was looking at. If the rook takes here on g5, then the queen's going to come down to d4, check. Then really need to have some sort of protection. So queen here to c5, rook to e6. It'd be great if there was an exchange, but that's not what white's looking to do here since black is at material. So first takes the pawn up here. Now the queen takes, pawn takes here. And this is just interesting. Both sides are equal in material. Bobby Fischer does have the minor piece in the bishop, but he's just going to have to worry about so many pawns. That's not the way Bobby Fischer wants to play this game. He can't really be as aggressive as he wants to. So in the game, after the rook comes to e4, a lot of stuff going on in this position. Bobby Fischer looks at it and says, although I do have the queen and the rook here, I'm going to go ahead and bring my rook back here to d8, attacking the queen here on h8. Another thing this does for Bobby Fischer, it's a discovered attack with this bishop on this rook here on e4. So just another strong attack, attacking now both the rook and the queen. Queen being the most important piece for Spassky. He decides to go ahead and bring that here to g7. Then the queen comes to f5, attacking now two attackers on this rook on e4, as well as the knights here on g5. Now we see the king come up here to b3, and then Bobby Fischer plays queen to d5. I think he had a stronger attack if he brings his rook down here to d1, trying to get this rook behind enemy lines. He has so many strong attacks he can have now with this queen to d5 if it wants to, and there's a lot more attacks that Bobby Fischer has, limited squares that Spassky can go to with this rook back here. We could see the rook come to, e2 now. And then after e2, maybe queen to d5, and then after king to b2, we can see that the pressure start to build here, and there's not a ways for white to really defend this very well. The queen here on g7, it's not going to be getting involved into the action near quick enough. And so I think this was a stronger way to go in the game, but decided to play queen here to d5, king to a3, queen to d2. So trying to do it all by himself here on d2 with his queen. This allows the rook to come over here to b4, and this is going to be a huge defender for white. Queen to c1, check. But you can see this rook is just able to defend since there's only one attacker here. Queen here to a1, rook here to a2, so just repeating the moves. Queen to c1, rook here to b2, and we repeat it once again, and we do have a draw in this position and have repeated the moves enough to have a draw. So at the end of the day, we do have back-to-back draws. Game 14 and now game 15, Bobby Fischer still has a 3-point advantage. So things are looking bright, especially with the black pieces. Now Bobby Fischer will have the white pieces look to extend his lead. But a knight dwarf defense that we really haven't seen. Before it was the poison pawn. Now getting into the main line, both sides really had an opportunity to take it. White was leading for much of the game. Then he decided to get a little aggressive with his queen over on the king side of the board, really took his queen out of the equation. Then Bobby Fischer at the end of that was able to really find a strong attack, but just wasn't able to capitalize, put all of pieces together, and get that into a win. So at the end of the day, an exciting match for a draw, but no player was able to get the final victory. But that is game 15 in the 1972 World Chess Championship. Hopefully you guys are enjoying the series, and I will see you guys in the next video for game number 16.